Hello, I'm Lou and welcome back to Open Up the Cloud. This is another video in this series about the Cloud Resume Challenge, and we're actually now onto the CI/CD part of the challenge, which I think is step 14, maybe. So a lot of people have asked me before, where they was asking about what is CI/CD. So let's quickly just break down what CI/CD is before we get into the actual the code changes that we'll be doing a little bit later on in the video. So CI stands for continuous integration and CD stands for continuous deployment. Now, in the context of the challenge, in terms of continuous integration, let's just break down what that actually means. So continuous integration doesn't really make sense on an individual perspective. You actually have to start thinking about things from a team perspective. So let's say that there is two of you working on the same piece of code. Now, or working on the same code base. Now, when you both go away and you start working on that code, you're going to have to decide at which point you're going to want to bring that code and put it back together. You're going to have to decide how often you want to integrate it. So let's say that I'm making some changes and you're making some changes to a piece of code, and then a couple of days later I say that, okay, cool, I'm going to bring my code back and I'm going to integrate that back into our sort of central repository of code. Now, the problem with that is if there's two of us, it's quite unlikely if we coordinate that we won't, for instance, touch the same files and touch the same functions. But if you can imagine across a big team and a really big code base, the idea, the chances of you touching the same code at the same time are actually very high. And that's where this whole idea of CI comes from, which stands for continuous integration, because you're continuously integrating code back together. You're making short branches, you're making small changes, and you're bringing them back into the central repository as often as possible. Now, where things get kind of complicated is because when people say CI, CD, or CI itself, often they're talking about the tooling that helps you implement continuous integration. Now, I don't want to get into a holy war. There's no point getting into sort of a debate on the confusion around this. But for the purpose of the Cloud Resume Challenge, I think what it basically helps to think about CI as is basically just automation. It's automation that's going to help you do things like running tests, running builds, and deploying things so that if you're in a work environment, that things are a little bit faster. You're going to be more incentivized to bring your code together and integrate it more frequently. And basically, it's just going to help foster some team practices between your teams. So I think that's kind of enough context, I think, in order to get into the actual context of the video today. But that's just what you need to think about. When you see the workflow file within GitHub Actions and you actually see that working, I think you'll start to understand a bit more about how continuous integration works. But let's just get into it. Let's have a look at the code, and I think that's probably one of the best ways that you're going to wrap your head around about how this all works. Okay, so in this part, what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at step 14 as part of the Cloud Resume Challenge, which you can see here is CI/CD for the backend. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this first part here, and we're actually going to ignore the second part. We're going to come back to that in a subsequent or one of the next videos. So this first part says, set up GitHub Actions such that when you push an update to your server's application model template or Python code, your Python test get run. Now, I'm using Golang. You may be using Python or maybe using something else, that's okay. Basically, the steps are going to be very, very similar. So I'll take you through what I've done and I'll show you how that works. So for this step, what we're going to do is we're going to use in GitHub Actions. Let me jump into my browser actually. So GitHub Actions then on the free tier actually has 2,000 minutes that you can use. So it's entirely free. It's within the sort of the boundaries of what we'll need. We're very unlikely that you're going to exceed that number. So that will work just fine for you. And that means it's going to be $0 a month for you. So the way that GitHub Actions works, so all you need to do is if you've got your repo already in GitHub, which I imagine most of you probably do, but if you've got your GitHub repo already set up, what you need to do is create a directory which is called .github. You might already have that because some other metadata files from GitHub live in there. But if you don't, just go ahead and make one. And then within that folder, create another folder called workflows. And then within that folder is where all your actual workflows, all your GitHub action files are going to live. Now, those files within that workflow, you can have multiple, and they can actually be named anything. There does need to be a YAML file that also adheres to the GitHub Action syntax. In this case, I've got one called main file or main.yaml, and why it's called main doesn't really matter. It's slightly an arbitrary choice. You can choose whatever you want. If you want to call it automation, you want to call it main, you want to call it build, it doesn't really matter too much. It's up to you. And if I go ahead and open that, what we'll see is the sort of basic structure of how the GitHub Actions workflow files look. So what you've got here is just the name of the file, and that's just used for associating it in the interface, which we'll see later. What we've got up here is this on event, which is basically telling GitHub when to run this workflow. Now, in this case, what we're saying is on push, and what that means is when you push changes, so when things are synced up to GitHub, so when you commit and you push up to your remote repository, that means it's going to trigger this particular workflow. Now, in my case, I've got this environment here called for Go version. You won't need that. Maybe you want to set that for Python version, but that's just referenced later in the file. And then this is where we get to sort of the interesting bit. So within a GitHub Actions workflow, you have a number of jobs. In this case, we've just got one job for now, but we'll have more later on. And this one just called it build infra. So this is going to build. In fact, this actually doesn't do the build. This just tests. So actually, let's call that test infra. It's a bit more descriptive. And what that's going to do is that's going to run on Ubuntu. Ubuntu is just the base image that we're going to run on. It doesn't really matter too much for you. You can use Ubuntu latest. It's probably going to work just fine. I wouldn't worry about that too much. And then within your actual pipeline, what we've got here is a number of different steps. So check out, what that's going to do is actually check out the repo that we're working in. 9 times out of 10, you're going to want to run this step at the start of your workflows anyway. And then underneath that, what I've got is setup Go, which is going to download, install, and set up everything for my Go, including my Go version, which is nice for me. And then the real interesting bit here is this is the main part for today, which is the actual testing part. So we've got 2 steps here, one for testing my get function and one for testing my put function. And all I'm doing there is I'm changing directory into my Cloud Resume Challenge get function folder, running my tests in there. Then I'm going back out, and then I'm going back into the put function folder and running the tests in there as well. And now, basically, when you commit and push this up to GitHub, GitHub's going to pick that up and it's going to run this workflow file. So let me show you what that looks like over here. So if I go to my repository, so I've been running this a few times already, and you can see, so this latest one is one that I've just done now, and that actually has the test running in it. So if you go to your repository up here, you'll see this GitHub Actions tab. If you click on that, in fact, let me go back to that level before. So you click on that, and what you'll see on the left-hand side is you've got workflows. As I say, you can have any number of different workflows within that directory. I'm not sure what the max is. I've never really reached it, but quite a few. And then you see here, I've got my main workflow. So now if I click on that, it's going to filter my workflows, but because I've only got one, it's the same number of workflows. And I'm going to go ahead and have a look at this top one. So this is my actual workflow runs. If I go back, actually, let me show you again. So every time you push, you're potentially going to create a new workflow run, and that's what you can see here. So you can see each different sort of instance of a workflow run. This one's 15 minutes ago, 36 minutes ago, 38 minutes ago. So that's what this is on this page. It's an overview of all the different workflows. Click into that one, and then what we get is our actual build page, so for our specific run. And what we see over here is we've got jobs, build infra. If I go back, if you remember, so I've got this jobs up here, and now, well, I renamed it now to test infra. So if I was to run that again, it would say test infra. But we've got basically just one job there. And that's what appears over here. So we've got build infra over here. Now, if I basically open that up, this will show me the individual steps. Again, let me go back to the code. And we see here we've got these steps. And in this case, we've got these different 4 steps here. And then those are the same as the 4 steps here. However, you've got a little bit of additional stuff here like setup, which is on GitHub side. Don't worry about that too much. And then basically we've got our 2, let me make this just a little bit bigger. We've got our 2 individual steps here that we were interested in. If I go ahead and open those up, what I've got there is basically Go, just running some tests. And provided that passes, the workflow passes, and then everything continues and everything's good. If you raise, for instance, a pull request on GitHub, when you do a push like this, it's going to add that as a check, and maybe you can set that up to prevent, for instance, you merging code into the main branch, which is something that's quite common, is to prevent people from merging things into, let's say, into your main branch without having things tested. And that's just one way that you can enforce it, is setting up something like this to run every time you push. And then that's just going to make sure that things are tested when they're brought into the main branch, and then nothing's then broken, everyone can keep collaborating and everything's working fine. So that's it for this step. It's sort of a soft introduction to GitHub Actions. The workflow that you need at this stage is not that complicated, so have a go setting up this sort of basic workflow. What you can do is just try creating a hello world at first, like try and get this just to log out something, hello world, or hi, and just see if you can get that to trigger inside of GitHub, so that you're actually seeing that this actions tab is everything's populated in here. You're seeing your workflows pull through. And then once you've got that hello world, then you start Googling around and having a look for the equivalent sort of setup that you'll need for your language. And if that's Python, you'll need to go and have a look for the setup for Python. And I'm sure there's a bunch of examples out there that you can grab for that. And then you'll want to find out some of the best practices around running unit tests for your individual language. Luckily for me, Go comes with the test sort of libraries and things like that, all just bundled within the typical Go binary. So considering I'm using Go, I don't need to do anything different. But if you're in Python, you might want to go and have a look at the different libraries and packages that are available in Python and which one that you want to go down. So that's it for this step. In the next couple of videos, what we'll do is we'll go through actually the next step of part 14. If I jump back to the instructions on the Cloud Resume, there was this part 2 here, right? So if the tests pass, the SAM application should package and deploy, and we'll do that in the next video. Okay, so that actually wraps up the first part of the CI/CD part. Now what we've done is added our tests into our pipeline. So I hope from seeing that what I said at the start of the video, basically saying that if you see the file, I think you're going to understand a bit more of what CI actually means. So take what we've done there and go and have a play with it and see if it starts to make a bit more sense. Once you've then played with that file and actually created that CI file within GitHub Actions, then I would say then go do some Googling about what CI actually is and read some of the different documentation and things like that online. And then hopefully things will start to make a bit more sense now that you've actually had the hands-on introduction to some CI tooling, and hopefully that will start to demystify this whole CI/CD bit. But in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to progress on from our unit tests and we're going to actually deploy our infrastructure into AWS, and that will involve some interesting things like adding secrets to GitHub Actions and stuff like that, but that'll be in the next video. So if you're following along with the series, I will see you in the next video.